Bonjour, bonjour, mes amis. It is delightful to be here with you this evening, in particular, having such an important conversation. Tonight, we're going to be diving into genes that can curate how you work to prevent breast cancer, how you inform that in a very intelligent way in your day to day, as well as your larger health planning. I am joined this evening by nerd extraordinaire, Dr. Betty Murray. Medell, how are you this evening?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Good. Well, you know that my mood is 100% correlated to heat, and I'm in Toronto. It is warm, so I am exceptionally happy today.
You can come visit me in Texas and you can feel what real warmth is.
So that's what everyone says, and I have yet to meet an environment where I'm like, oh, that's too hot. And one day that will happen, but until that day, I welcome and I say yes. Audience, I'm curious, where are you guys calling in from? And separate to that, how hot is it where you are? We have one Celsius speaking person, we have one Fahrenheit and Celsius speaking person, so we'll be able to translate wherever it might be, because I know we have a happy smattering from the US and beyond. So please let us know how warm it is there so I can be a little bit jealous. Yeah. All right. So, Dr. Murray, where do you want to, when I think about breast cancer, in particular, breast cancer prevention, one of the first things, at least I see that women asking about is they start that conversation with BRCA. So why don't we start our conversation with BRCA as well? And so can you talk to me a little bit around what is BRCA, is why there's hype around it, and why, yes, there should be hype, but well, so what is its limitations? Because it's not the panacea, it's not the be all end all of kind of genetic information when it comes to breast cancer.
Right, right. So the BRCA gene actually only accounts for about 8% of all breast cancers. So what that
Hmm.
means is 92% of the people that get breast cancer have nothing to do with BRCA,
Yeah.
right? And we have to remember, and so that's the first part is BRCA actually plays
Hmm.
a small role in breast cancer. The other thing is BRCA has zero to do with estrogen. And I think that's the hardest
Hmm.
thing because we
Yeah.
get all of this misinformation that gets perpetuated in the media, and we get
Yeah.
told that estrogen causes cancer, and then therefore, BRCA is the cancer risk, and so people start to meld those together. The BRCA gene actually does several things. It helps repair DNA. So think of it as like the spell check in your DNA, and it's there to repair spelling errors. And if there's DNA breaks and things like that, BRCA is responsible for doing that. It also is involved in controlling cell division. So cancer cells
Mhm.
tend to rapidly divide, right? Much more so
Mhm.
than regular ones. And it influences other genes. So when you have, and it even affects tumor suppressor genes. So we have genes in our body that go, hey, don't be a weird cell. We got to shut it
Yeah.
down. Shut it
Hmm.
down. Very
Yeah.
easy stuff. So when you couple that all together, if you happen to be a BRCA carrier, what's really happening is your cells can get a spelling error,
Hmm.
divide and replicate more frequently, and then
Hmm.
have an inability to sort of suppress potentially damaging tumor messages if the cell starts to go rogue. And
Hmm.
so BRCA plays a role, but it really isn't the big player when we look at just
Yeah.
the growth of breast cancer as a whole, and then
Hmm.
especially why we see more of it today.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I like what you've said there, and I want to tease out two really important parts. I think the first part that you touched on, I think is going to be important to the balance of our webinar, is this idea that the body has a lot of mechanisms to not only identify when things are going rogue, when you're kind of getting this potential cancer situation of too many cells growing. Um, there, so not only does the body have a lot of mechanisms to kind of be like, not today, and stop that, there's also this idea that cancer to an extent is happening every single day in your body, but beautifully, all miraculously, every single day in your body's also saying, not today, and squashing that. So I think that's a really important part to hear. Number one, there's many different mechanisms, BRCA being part of that, that squashes cancer if it's trying to poke its head up. But separate to that, your body has a lot of wonderful machinery that quashes this sort of stuff when things go wrong. And I think that's a really important part as we start to get our heads wrapped around how do we create a personalized plan to the end of prevention.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And so, when you're looking at genetics and the genetics risk for cancer, yes,
Yeah.
BRCA is a slightly more determinate or diagnostic
Hmm.
gene.
Yeah.
But when we really get into it, it's more about the constellation of genes that have to do with how
Yes.
our body processes toxins and other things, and then
Yeah.
how those things may play a role in actually changing cellular DNA expression and sort of the cleanup process and those
Yeah.
things. And I
Yeah.
think that's the part that is important, because that's the stuff that we can actually have
Yeah.
agency over the most.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. While it will vary cancer by cancer, by and large, when we talk about cancer, 80, oh, dear cat, 80% of cancers are caused by diet and lifestyle sort related elements as opposed to genetic elements. So audience, hear that. It's not that we want to belittle BRCA, but we also don't want it being a disproportionate portion of your mind and fear set and kind of solution set. Yeah, so what Dr. Murray and I are going to be going over today is what you can add to your toolbox on the day today, as well as that larger planning perspective of how to go about preventing it, in particular in a personalized way that reflects your genes. So when Betty and I were discussing this, we first want to start off with, I'm going to pull up the survey results a little bit earlier on because we did ask you, audience, how old you are. And that's really going to influence the content of what we're talking about because different age groups will encourage different plans. So, audience, Dr. Murray and I show up to the end of supporting you. And part of that support is really understanding what you're here to learn, what you want to know. And the audience was great. And so far, they've told me 100 degrees in Oregon is highest that I've seen there.
Yeah.
Australia's in winter, so sucks to be you. I'm so sorry. Summer's coming again. And that some places are really cold, and that makes me sad. All right. From an age perspective, majority of our audience is 65 and above. That's about 50% of our audience. Um, Another 20% is going to be sitting 55 to 65. We have another 20% at 45 to 55, yeah, 54. So a majority of our audience, I'm going to imagine we are either, if not on that peri, definitely on the menopausal side of things. So that is going to inform how we talk about it. But we do have a beautiful 6% of our audience that is between 35 and 44. So we'll make sure that we're offering some tips for those that are still menstruating, as well as women in the crowd who know people who are still menstruating. We want to offer that to you as well so that you can share that because it's important. Women are very communal creatures. We share, and that's a beautiful thing about how we practice medicine. We asked you, do you have a history of breast cancer? 20% speaks to a personal history, 33% speak to a family history, um, and 45% of our audience very beautifully is speaking to the end of, nope, but I want to be proactive. So I'm grateful for that. 2% of our audience is not sure. I would speculate we see this a lot within adoption cases or perhaps like refugee cases where there's not access to family history. Yeah, yeah, half of my family health history is not known of consequence to that. So we'll also speak, I think that's a beautiful space where genes can really be helpful insofar as even if you don't have the family history, we now have science that can peer into your family history, which is a beautiful thing. Yeah. Number three, are you concerned about your risk? 50% of our audience is saying somewhat, not topical, but it's there. 30% very concerned, very valid. It's talked about a lot. And then a beautiful 20% is chill and be like, yeah, not so much. So I value that. The last question that we have here today, what are you hoping to take from this webinar? A majority of the audience is really looking at how genetics impact breast cancer risk. So audience will make sure that we're very specific around the genes as well as the allelic presentation. So if you have your DNA 360, please do get that out. We're going to be looking mostly, not exclusively, but mostly at the hormone and fitness section. So if you want to bump on to the summary page there, we'll reference genes there. The other genes, we'll make sure we say them a bit slower so you can look them up after the fact. The other thing that people are hoping to really understand is prevention strategies, so close, that they can know, as well as how hormones and inflammation play a role there. So Dr. Murray, I'm glad you're here because I know you are an expert in all of these things and I'm grateful for you. So let's let's start with some considerations outside of BRCA. Where from that diet and lifestyle perspective, and I'll chime in with genes as we go along, but when we think of how do we go about preventing breast cancer, let's ground ourselves. Where do we want to start with some of those thoughts?
Yeah, I think first let's ground ourselves with what the real data is, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
in age group, in population, what is the real risk profile? Because there's a lot of numbers that get thrown around. Like 1 in 8 often gets thrown around. You
Mm.
know, 1 in 8 people will get
Yeah.
breast cancer. I'm like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
no, that's not true. Now, if you're 85, 1 in 8, right? Like, so it's that's age group
It's age
appropriate.
stratified.
It's age stratified. So that's actually really, really wrong. So I want to make sure that we have this. Now, some of these things have been changing post pandemic. Right.
Yes.
So when we look at like the risk profile, if you are, and this is based on, kind of a conglomerate of different studies because they're going to vary slightly. So if you're in your 30s, the risk is about 0.5% of the population, like so extremely, extremely low,
Mm-hmm.
extremely low. If we're in our 40s, it goes to go to about 1.6% per decade for like a 10-year span. 50s and 60s, it starts to escalate a little bit more at about 3.5%. And then
Mm-hmm.
over 70. So here's where it gets interesting. 50 to 70, it only goes to 4%. So the biggest
Mm.
jump, I want to point that out. The biggest jump is when perimenopause to menopause,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then when we look at that, when we look at the total lifetime risk, and if someone makes it to like, your late 80s and 90s, that's where that 1 in 8 comes in because the average age of diagnosis, the median age is 62. So it is
Mm-hmm.
well past perimenopause, well past menopause.
Mm-hmm.
And when your hormones are at their lowest, and they have been for a very long time, what we do see is there is an increasing amount of women being diagnosed with breast cancer younger. That was already a
Mm-hmm.
trend in the last 20 years. I have my opinions on why that is. But we do see kind of an uptick post COVID
Mm-hmm.
that we can't quite explain, along with the fertility changes and other things. And I would say it's inflammatory response with
Yeah.
spike protein activity, kind of liking reproductive tissues and hormone
Yeah.
sensitive tissues. So the risk profile is there, but it's not what people think, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think, breast cancer is so disfiguring
Yeah.
and it gets a lot of press. So it's the thing that we are frightened the most of.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
here's the stats that are really important, right? So the biggest risk things that actually increase risk is obviously aging. So as we get older, the spelling errors
Mm-hmm.
happen because that's part of the aging process.
Yep.
If we were to look at aging as a disease state, it's the one thing that is that cause for all chronic disease is just getting older, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of researchers that are sort of pushing to kind of look at it that way because we would fund it differently. So
Yeah.
aging does that, right? So we can't
Mm-hmm.
outrun aging. Hormonal changes, right? So a decline in our own estrogen increases our risk for breast cancer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, reproductive history.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a later age, right, later age of starting your first menstrual period, shorter reproductive lifespan, less pregnancies are also like, right, we have more risk, but that's a small, like me. But here's the
Mm-hmm.
big ones. Are you overweight? Do you drink? And then exercise.
Mm-hmm.
I give some stats on that because I think it's really, really important.
Yeah.
So depending on the study, if you look at being overweight or obese, so overweight, BMI, up from 25 to 29 and then 30 and above, right? So
Yeah.
depending on the study, you're looking at like a 16 to 23% increased risk for breast cancer. That's hugely statistically significant. And same thing with
Mm-hmm.
alcohol. Alcohol is like 14 to 17%.
Yeah.
Some studies bigger, but I would say, wouldn't you say it probably lands in that range some there, because all the studies vary. So
Yeah.
if you go home and have a glass of wine every night to wind down to cook dinner and
Mm.
you're carrying extra body weight, that is
Mm-hmm.
by far amplifying your risk for breast cancer in a way that hormone replacement would never do,
Yeah.
right? Which
Yeah.
means we can actually do something about it, right? We can
Yeah.
actually reduce those risks
Yeah.
significantly.
Yeah. 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 Do you have stats? I love that you're such a number person. Do you have stats? Because the other two elements that come to mind as increasing risk would be lack of sleep,
Yep.
and then separate to that, um, oh, hold on, I had it. Oh,
Oops,
she
sorry.
just left. Let's talk about sleep, and I'm going to come back to the other one that just floated away from my mind. Oh, stress. Because I think stress is, I would argue and offer stress is an independent risk increase for cancer. It's just hard to come across some of the studies that will put a number to it because it's still such an ethereal thing to study. Do you by chance, I see your cogs moving. Do you perchance have numbers on either of these
Yeah, I'm
things?
double checking myself just because I hadn't pulled them beforehand. So,
Yeah.
sleep deficiency. So, this could be everything from poor sleep quality
Yeah.
to inadequate duration. So, you fall asleep and can't stay asleep, or
Hmm.
you're waking up constantly.
Yeah.
And it depends. So, several of the studies looked at it, but one of the bigger studies showed it had a 24% increased risk for
Hmm.
developing breast cancer compared to those with better sleep profiles.
Hmm.
There was also a meta-analysis that showed increased risk for particularly estrogen sensitive cancers if they
Yeah.
slept less than 6 hours. Right, there was a
Yeah.
slightly elevated. So we know sleep does that for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, Now, if we look at stress,
Yeah.
chronic stress for sure can also do that too.
Mhm.
It's a little less clear because it's a,
Yeah.
a harder thing to calculate, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think in some special populations, so for example, caregivers are often studied for health outcomes. Caregivers are people who tend to have incredible amounts of stress, and we see cancer rates go up there. So
Yeah.
it's a little easier in certain populations. But I do want to put forward stress because I think stress makes sleep difficult, and stress also shifts kind of cortisol and how body goes about resting and repairing, which is really important and something that doesn't always get considered in these preventative conversations because, again, just like sleep, stress isn't a sexy thing to talk about.
Well, it's one of those things that's like to whom and how much, right? I
Yeah.
like to say we
Yeah.
have a threshold for it.
Yeah.
Some people have a shoebox size threshold for stressful environments,
Hmm.
for genetics, right? If you've had your
Yeah.
DNA, you probably know whether you're one of those people. And then some
Yeah.
people have like a moving van size of what they're able to take, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
a lot of that may be perceived as well, but some of the studies are like between 11%, 16% increased risk for cancer related to perceived level of stress. Nurses
Hmm.
studies are also really good for that.
Yes.
But if we look at like adverse childhood events, right? So there is the adverse
Yes.
childhood events, which is a
Hmm.
standardized questionnaire
Hmm.
across the board for basically all chronic diseases, but particularly cancer as well. The higher you score on that, meaning, death of a parent,
Hmm.
anything you can think of, big T and little t traumas, the
Yeah.
more those add up, the more likely you are to have cancer and
Hmm.
other disease states.
Yeah.
Right. So we
Yeah.
can't overlook it. It's just very hard to get a qualified score,
Yeah.
because here's my hope. We would have a DNA test to kind of know how
Yeah.
you're wired, right?
Yep.
Because I'm one of those people, I don't feel it, right? I'm
Yeah.
like, what? I'm good. Like I
Look
have to
at
have,
you.
I
Yeah.
have to have it takes a lot for me,
Hmm.
right? And,
Hmm.
but, that doesn't mean I don't have it. It's
Yeah.
just my perception of it is different, right?
Yep.
And I
Yep.
think that's hard,
Absolutely.
but stress is absolutely one of those things. And
Yeah.
sometimes we can't turn down the stress that we might be in because we
Hmm.
have to get well in an environment that may very well be triggering us and making us not well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that. So why don't we start talking through some of the genes and some of the hormones, right? Because I think you kicked this off, your first comment in regards to BRCA. BRCA has nothing to do with estrogen directly.
Mm-mm.
And so let's talk about estrogen, its relation to breast cancer, and kind of why hormones and sound hormonal health throughout the course of your life is an element of prevention towards breast cancer.
Right, right. So breast tissue, ovarian tissue, uterine tissue, and actually, really honestly, every single cell in your body except for two have
Hmm.
estrogen receptors.
Hmm.
So it's really important to acknowledge that estrogen doesn't selectively just hang out at the ovaries, the uterus, and the breast. It
Hmm.
has a full body effect all the way down to your mitochondria, right?
Hmm.
So they're everywhere. However, the breast tissue, ovarian tissue, and uterine tissue have lots and lots of
Hmm.
receptors for estrogen, and it turns on things. Same thing with progesterone, same thing with
Hmm.
testosterone, sex hormones, and
Hmm.
it turns on things, right? And so, there's always been this perception of, well, how much is estrogen playing a role or not playing a role?
Hmm.
Well, here's some of the things that are kind of interesting. So we have different types of breast cancer, and we have different types of tissue cancer. We have ductal
Hmm.
carcinoma in situ. We have adenocarcinoma. We have all these different cancers. I won't go into all the different names, but we have what they call triple negative breast cancer. And then we have receptor positive breast cancer. So I'm going to cover receptor positive. Receptor positive means that when we have this tumor cell, so that's a cell that didn't get the kill signal. We have cells that live for a certain period of time, and then they're supposed to create a sister and then die off. Well, tumor cells have broken mitochondria. They don't get the kill signal, and then they start replicating themselves and bringing blood supply and all kinds of things. Well, when those breast tissues, cells, tumor cells, still have some of their function, they often have an estrogen and or progesterone receptor on them, right? So when we look at breast cancer, when we have a breast cancer cell that is ER positive, estrogen receptor positive, or estrogen or progesterone receptor positive, it means it retains some of its receptor activity, right? So now, triple negative, the opposite side of that. Triple negative is a much faster growing tumor, much more invasive. It has no receptors on it. It doesn't have any sex hormone receptors on it, and it grows much faster. When we look at like the Petri dish studies and what's really happening in the estrogen receptor positive tumors, some estrogens being exposed to it will increase proliferation, not all, right? And not all tumors, but it retains that receptor. And so the drugs, the chemotherapy drugs we use, are using that receptor to act on the tumor, right? To act on the tumor. And even some of the drugs that we use, like tamoxifen, are kind of geared to sort of block some of that activities to make sure that the receptor doesn't have actionable receptor function for a hormone to actually dock into the receptor. So think of that as like a key that clicks in. And then there's even like HER2 and other sort of receptor activities that can influence how that cell works. What always was confusing, not confusing to me, it was confounding. That's a better word, because I would say I'm not confused by it. What was confounding to me, and this is just a logic conversation. So the more children you have, the longer you have for menstrual cycles, the less likely you are to have breast cancer. So for the people that knock out 10, 12 children, they have very low risk for breast cancer. Now, the reality is your estrogen and progesterone during pregnancy are off the chart high for months on end, right? Your ovulation levels and your luteal phase levels are really, really low, right? Compared to it. So if we look at that, those are really high hormone events in your life.
Yeah.
Reduces your risk for breast cancer. So I want you to let that sink in for a moment. If you're like me, you started early, ended early, no children. I have an increased risk regardless of my genetics or anything else, because I didn't have a bunch of children, right? I have an increased risk. Now, what does that tell you? The other thing is if you have high hormones when you're a teenager, high hormones in your 20s, your 30s, and probably into your 40s for some of us, right? Your risk for breast cancer goes up as your hormones stop, and they go up exponentially at menopause. So if it was our hormones, wouldn't every 20-year-old have breast cancer? Right? Like, okay, so the idea that estrogen, your own estrogen, your biological, bioidentical hormone drives cancer risk, then we should be seeing it in teenagers and 20s, not 62 as the average age.
Yeah. I've always found this, and I say this more from the perspective of a bystander of all the breast cancer literature, et cetera. It, to an extent, has vilified and demonized estrogen to the point where oftentimes people are coming in and what can I do to get rid of my estrogen? Right? And we forget how many powerful, protective, functional things it does within the body. To echo back to what you said, save two types of cells. There are receptors on every single tissue that we have in the body. It influences insulin and therefore our blood sugar regulation. It influences our bones and therefore our ability to move and be strong within the world. It influences our mind and cognition, right? Any woman who's gone postmenopausal and whose estrogen's a little bit fritzy can tell you that, right? There's so many different things that influences, and yet it's this thing that we're told to be scared of in terms of breast cancer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It defies logic. So here's another logic question for you. So tamoxifen, which is one of the kind of hallmarks of treating estrogen sensitive cancer, particularly in a postmenopausal woman, is
Mm.
a synthetic estrogen. It's a
Yeah.
synthetic estrogen, but it is one of the
Yeah.
most powerful anti-cancer drugs we have. Now,
Hmm.
it doesn't mean you feel good on it, but I'm
Yeah.
just saying that's it's so the reality
Yeah.
is our body doesn't make things within it that are cancer promoting in a healthy environment, right? Or it's
Yeah.
that's not what's doing it, right? That
Yeah.
defies logic.
Hmm.
And so I think that's the hard part because we hear all these things about our hormones being bad and I need to get rid of every bit
Yeah.
of estrogen. I'm like, you really don't want to do that.
Yeah. You're
Heart's
not
gonna
going to
hurt,
be you're
everything's
not going to
gonna
be happy.
right.
Yeah.
Well, and yeah, you're gonna end up with all causes of aging. Um, so the truth is estrogen is protective against breast cancer in all
Hmm.
those age groups. And when you actually look at the data in the research, including the Women's Health Initiative, which is the one
Hmm.
that got it vilified to begin with, the women that were on Premarin alone, oral horse pea, estrogen, 13 different estrogens, which we're going to talk about when we hit the DNA stuff, 13 different estrogens in it. That was standard of care from the 50s onward, right? Approved for the
Hmm.
treatment of osteoporosis in 1988. Absolutely one of the most prescribed drugs on the planet. It actually outpaced statin drugs at one point, right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I'll do it.
40 to 70% of women in the Western world at some point in their life were put on Premarin during that time period as standard of care
Yeah.
until the Women's Health
Yeah.
Initiative. Their own study showed that the women that were on Premarin had a 23% reduced risk in their 60s on average, because that's what the
Yeah.
age group was, than the people who had nothing at all.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
So I look at that and I go, okay, so our estrogen and bioidentical estrogen, which means the key that your body makes
Yeah.
that's estrogen, and we make it and we do it in a lab and it looks just like that, is not cancer producing. Then what is?
Hmm.
Right? What is? And I would argue this is my hypothesis, right?
Hmm.
My hypothesis is when we go through menopause and we
Yeah.
lose that estrogen, right? We
Hmm.
lose our natural production of estrogen. We have receptors, right? We
Hmm.
have an estrogen receptor A, which is cancer proliferative.
Hmm.
You don't want to stimulate the heck out of that one. We
Hmm.
have estrogen receptor B that's cancer protective.
Hmm.
Your natural estrogens both touch each receptor, but they lean on that B more strongly.
Yeah.
When you no longer have that, you still have receptors. And actually, Lisa Mosconi's group out of the Weil Center showed that when we go through menopause, we actually produce more receptors, particularly in the brain. Right. So as you
Hmm.
lose it, your body tries to grab more of it.
Yeah.
We don't know
Mhm.
about the rest of the body, but I would put money that the same thing is happening.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when I don't have my estrogen to hold that receptor, what do you think goes in there? Because it's there.
Mm.
There's a keyhole. Something's going in the keyhole. And
Audience, any thoughts?
what do you think?
I venture our audience is very smart and probably knows this too. Audience, what do you think is going in the keyhole if not estrogen?
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think is going in there?
Yeah.
You can put it in the chat.
Please. Oh, it's okay. It's so funny when you ask. Well, I always find like when someone asks me a question, I'm like, I know the answer, but I'm not going to answer. What happens if I
Right. I'm
don't?
not going to answer it. Right.
And
Okay.
then they put
So,
the answer out there and they're like, oh, I knew that.
yeah, yeah. Toxins,
Yeah.
right? Pesticides, herbicides, plasticizers, phthalates, fragrances, all of the
All
things,
the fun things.
estrogens, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because those you're getting exposed to every day, all the time.
Hmm. Hmm.
If I don't have my own hormones sitting in that receptor, I still have receptors. And I
Yeah.
still have things I'm getting exposed to.
Yeah.
And I still have things that my body has to detoxify or biotransforms, a technical term
Yeah.
for it, to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Right. So that's
Yeah.
a big part of what we look at. Because if we look at, 50, 100 years ago, the risk for breast cancer was much lower.
Hmm.
Our genes
Yeah.
didn't change, our environment did.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think part of the interesting thing too is the bioaccumulation of this sort of stuff within the body, right? So, there's many different categories, some of which bioaccumulate, meaning body is either very slow at or does not yet know how to eliminate it.
Yeah.
Therefore, if you're kind of pulling in 1 unit of this per day, Your body can't clear out 1 unit. So at the end of a week, you have 7 units. At the end of the next week, it's 14, right? It's stuff. And so because it's rummaging around there a lot longer, you run that risk of it rummaging up against receptors that you don't want it rummaging up against, right? And so I know a little bit where you're going insofar as part of the prevention strategy audience, since you really want to walk away with tangible tools, is I would say twofold. First of all, understanding where all your exposures are,
Mhm.
right? And then also knowing your genetic profile as to how sensitive you are to those,
Yeah.
right? It's not to say if you have a great profile, you get to bathe in all the plastic that you want, but
No,
it
no.
just shifts how much energy that you're going to be offering into those, right, Dr. Murray?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, as a personal note, like I started doing genetics probably 12 years ago, 12, 13, when
You're
they
an
first.
early adopter.
I was an
Yeah.
early adopter. There's a couple of reasons. Number one, I had horrible perimenopause. I was like, what's going on here? Number
The
two, I'm
best discoveries are selfish ones, and I mean that as a compliment. I mean that as such a compliment.
no, it's 100% true because again, if you know your own shared experience and your own
Yeah.
experience, it's easy to sort of look at it. And the other part was I was adopted. And so I didn't know my family history. I had no idea, but I already had some early
Yeah.
signs, some vascular issues and other things,
Hmm.
big breasts, so they were always like, you need to come back for another mammogram. I'm like, okay, I'm doing that, like, so I was like, I wanted to dig deeper, and I don't
Yeah.
actually work for the DNA company. I'm completely separate from it, but I have been
Yeah.
immersed in this world because I wanted
Yeah.
to understand because our genes aren't determinate. They aren't, a single gene really isn't in most cases. The ones we're talking about, SNPs, are not determinate. It's
Yeah.
about the grouping of those genes and
Yeah.
those pathways, and then what we're doing with our diet, lifestyle, and whether we're promoting positive things or promoting negative things.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so important, because we can do a lot to
Yeah.
change our exposures.
Yeah.
So if we look at, I think one of the questions, and we've already alluded to it, all the endocrine disrupting things, right?
Hmm.
Fragrance and
Hmm.
phthalates, the crap we put on our face, all of those things, when they
Yeah.
hit your skin, you breathe them, you eat them, whatever, they're in your bloodstream, and
Yeah.
they all have to go to the liver and move through your pathways of your genetics to get cleaned up. And
Yeah.
even if this is the other thing too, even if you have positive gene pathways,
Yeah.
right? This is a really good example. MTHFR. Most everybody
Hmm.
knows about that gene. Well, 49% of the population to 47, depending on which kind of ethnic background you have mutations, right?
Hmm.
Especially African, European, right?
Very common.
Super common.
Yeah.
But guess what? There are just as many people out there probably that have problems because they haven't touched a green vegetable in a decade.
Mm.
And they are not mutated on MTHFR, but their intake of folate from green leafy
Hmm.
vegetables is so low that they
Yeah.
look like and are driving the same inflammatory pathways as somebody whose DNA is
Yeah.
mutated and maybe they're not supporting it enough,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So your genes aren't determinate, but your lifestyle will drive it,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
that's the cool thing.
Yeah. Audience, just to underscore and echo here, largely the determinant genes, meaning if you have a gene, it's going to bring out something. There's a few exceptions, but largely those are things that percolate when you're in childhood. So if you are over the age of 15 to 18 and nothing's presented, there's really nothing in your genes that is going to destine you towards cancer or other conditions. What does destiny to you to, and this is things like the World Health Organization acknowledges this, most governmental bodies acknowledge this, it is your diet and lifestyle that determine where it is. So it's really important to know your genes, because I think to me that tells you where to focus energy and effort and where your weak points are. But that's not to the end of these genes. If you don't tend them, it means you're going to get cancer, right? It's just to help you kind of take one cup of the ocean as opposed to feel like you have to boil the entire ocean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that, yeah. So the beautiful thing is, and you can drive these pathways in positive
Yeah.
directions by changing diet and lifestyle, you know,
Yeah.
and so I think that's an important thing to do. So even if the first thing is like, okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to get rid of my plastic that I heat foods in and store foods,
Hmm.
that's the first biggie,
Yeah.
right? And then it might be cleaning up my body care supplies, right? And
Yeah.
then it might be cleaning up my my supplies that I use to clean my house. There's
Yeah.
And the other thing, we can get also very, very, very worried about these things and feel like we don't have an ability to go outside or eat out.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it as the 80-20 rule, right? If I'm
Yeah.
doing 80% of the time, I'm working towards being super, healthy. I'm doing
Mm-hmm.
all the things. I can get in contact and I can walk through a restaurant that's blowing some sort of Febreze kind of whatever in their air,
Yeah.
because people do it, or they got stinky candles on the table or whatever that may be. I can walk in there and I can handle it because I'm doing all these other things,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
the truth is, as soon as you detox, you retox by taking another breath.
Yeah. Yeah. And audience, I'll re-emphasize this. When we think about two people eating the exact same meal, and let's pretend these are twins, so exact the same, one person is enjoying and the other person is not. The person who is enjoying is deriving more nutrition and ability to incorporate the goodness of that meal, the health benefits of that meal, than the person who is not. And this gets back a little bit to the stress, when you're in a stress state, body is not responding to the world in a healthy way. It's responding to the world in a very defensive way. And defense is not a state where you can rest and repair. And it's the rest and the repair that quashes out the proverbial cancer. Yeah. So Dr. Betty, let's dive into a few more kind of takeaways for the audience of lifestyle and diet things that they can be doing. They can start today. Um, so so I hear a lot when it comes to lately, I've heard a lot about broccoli sort of supplements. And interestingly, I'll be honest, I've seen a few women start high dose and then they come back, especially menstruating women, they'll start high dose broccoli supplements and then they'll come back and be like, oh, my hormones are messed up. So
Yeah.
do you want to talk? Because I think they have an incredible space. I think they're very helpful, but we have to be mindful that they still are a medicinal compound that you can't drink like water. Do you want to talk a little bit about broccoli? So,
Yeah, I think it's also the more is not always better, right? Your
hmm.
body works in a system called hormesis. Hormesis is a fancy word of saying a little bit of a
Very
lot of different
fancy.
things all
Yeah.
together to hold things in balance.
Hmm.
So this is where we get to start talking about the hormone pathways that you see on the DNA hormone part of the test. And I'm going to start with the first one, CYP1A1, right? That metabolizes the estrogen byproduct. So I'm gonna do a visual. I don't have a tissue paper here, but we're gonna do a visual. Really quick. All right.
I
So
love
this
this.
is I love low tech, so I'm gonna do low tech. So imagine this highlighter. This highlighter here is an old piece of estrogen. It is leaking and running down my hand. Right. I've used it. It did its job. It now needs to go to the liver to get packaged.
Hmm.
So the CYP1A1 pathway is the green pathway. That's the most favorable pathway.
Yeah.
So it doesn't break it apart. So when I first went to school, I thought biotransformation was like, I broke a leg on a chair, so I'm going to break it apart and throw it in the trash. That's not actually how it works. It's adding things to it. It's wrapping it, right? And conjugating and those kind of things, right?
Mhm.
So I've got a green wrapper and I wrap it around it, right? That green wrapper makes sure that it goes down and makes 2-hydroxyestrone, right? Which is a cleaner estrogen byproduct. Broccoli, brassica family, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, flax lignans, genistein from soy, rosemary, berries all help you get more green wrappers, right?
Hmm.
So that's why broccoli has been labeled as a cancer protective food.
Yeah. A
But
superfood.
yeah, it's a superfood, right? Any dark green leafy thing is going to drive that, right? Kale, all of those. Sorry, Dave Asprey. Kale is actually okay as long as you don't overdo it, right?
I love that you included berries, though. I like that you diversified that a little bit. Yeah.
Exercise, T4, right? Right. There's other things that drive it too, but I get
Yeah.
lots of green wrapper, right? I want
Hmm.
lots of green wrapper.
Hmm.
So if I eat those things, great. Here's the thing though, but let's say if I go, oh, forget it. If some is good, I'm gonna down a bunch of it. The other thing it can do is it can preferentially reduce your circulating estradiol, which is the protective estrogen you want that helps
Hmm.
turn on the receptors in your body.
Yeah.
So if you're perimenopausal or you're taking hormone replacement and you overdo it, you're gonna
Yes.
you're gonna tank your hormones or you're gonna feel like you're all over
Yeah.
the place. Same
Yes.
thing with DIM or indole 3 carbinol. It's about the dose. More is
Yeah.
better. And I find practitioners all the time that overdose people on this. And then they keep raising their dose of estrogen when they're doing hormone replacement. I'm like, no, 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 no. It's not more is better here, right? And it's because they don't understand the
Yes.
complexity of this pathway,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
with CYP1A1, good clean estrogen, right? And
Yep.
depending on how you're wired genetically, you either do that well or not.
Yep.
I swore we were going to do one on my genetics. We were just going to rip apart my genetics. I don't do that well, right? I don't do that well, right? So we then have CYP3A4. I like to call
Mm-hmm.
that the blue wrapper. So some of the estrogen doesn't go to the green, it gets wrapped in a blue wrapper. Now, if I overproduce that, it comes down to 16 alpha hydroxyestrone, and then it gets made into estriol, which has some physiological effect, which is one of our other of the three
Mm-hmm.
hormones. That one's a little less favorable. If I get a lot of estrogen byproducts stuck in that pathway, it's more cell proliferative, right? So it can cause the cells to sort of overgrow,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in tissues, because we have to remember this is being expressed also in the tissues. It's not just kind of happening in the liver, it's expressing everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's a blue wrapper. I don't want a bunch of that. But again, I can manipulate that by pushing stuff towards the green and then blocking the red also. Now, the last one is CYP1B1, right?
Mm-hmm.
CYP1B1 is the red wrapper, kind of like Goldilocks. That's the one I don't really want to drive stuff down. That
Mm-hmm.
one makes a byproduct called 4-hydroxyestrone, which is known to change and damage the
Yeah.
DNA. It's inflammatory, so that can start causing spelling
Yeah.
errors,
Yeah.
right? Now, if I want to block that, I can do things like citrus bioflavonoid, grapefruit, hops.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm looking at what I'm trying to do, I can incorporate those foods. I can incorporate exercise, make sure my thyroid is dialed in. I can have rosemary I can do all these things, and
Mm-hmm.
it starts moving that pathway very, very cleanly, very nicely,
Yeah.
regardless of how you're wired. I have 2 mutations on CYP1B1, 2 on CYP3A4, and I think 1 on CYP1A1. I'm not
Yeah.
good at it.
Yeah. Yeah. I value the foods that you just offered that sat outside broccoli, as
Mhm.
well as the positioning of this is something you have some control over. You are not destined, you are not your genetic pathways insofar as they're important. And if you have them, like you said, you have to work harder at it.
Yeah,
You don't get a bit of a pass, right? Like you probably don't get as much flexibility on your diet in this regard because of your genes.
I'm much
Whereas
more.
someone with a better profile doesn't mean they get to eat all the things. It means they have a bit more flexibility.
Right, right, exactly. And so here's the thing. So once you have your DNA, you kind of know
Yeah.
how you're wired. That's not determinate though. Again, it
Yeah.
depends on what you're doing. So
Hmm.
the way to marry that and see what's happening in real time
Yeah.
is through a urine test. There's several companies
Yeah.
out there that do it, and we can see those pathways in real time.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
the other important thing is the green, red, and blue wrapper is only phase one. But the
Hmm.
other thing that's important is we're not done yet. Right. So the other way I like here's my other just visual example. You're cleaning out your house. So you start with your attic. That's phase one. You pull all the
Hmm.
crap out of your attic and you bring it down into the living room. You start wrapping wrappers
Yeah.
around it. You need to get it to the garage, which is phase
Yeah.
two. And phase two is controlled by COMT, your
Hmm.
glutathione activity,
Hmm.
sulfation, right?
Hmm.
That's the pink wrapper is COMT. Sulfation is the orange wrapper.
Yeah.
Glucuronidation is the black wrapper. So that has to happen in order. And that's getting it to the garage. So I get it to the garage, I wrap it in those different colored wrappers. So if I'm not good at glutathione or making glutathione again and again and again and regenerating it,
Yeah.
I won't be able to do that. Or if I have COMT mutations and I'm slow and I don't
Yeah.
have enough folate and B12, then it's going
Yeah.
to get stuck there. It's stuck in your garage. So leave your trash in your garage for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
What is that going to be like? Not good.
She stank.
Just dang.
She
So the last
stank.
step, last step is getting it to the dumpster, which is it's going to go out through the
Yeah.
urine or it's going to go out through the stool. So we can watch those steps.
Or,
Yeah,
or,
or go
or
back.
exercise sweat because she's the one that's always talking about exercise and I value that. Or
Mm-hmm.
sweat, which is
Yep.
such an important thing for
Yep.
those that are in the hot spaces after a hot, sweaty day, assuming you've been hydrated, you probably feel better because you're quite literally inside at least cleaner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because sweating is one of our largest organs of detoxification,
Yeah.
and so each one of those steps have to happen in order and balanced, right? I can't have a bunch of stuff get to phase one and not get through phase two because they get stuck. And
Yeah.
then your body is going to store them. They're going to store them in the fat cells And then in many cases, depending on what's going on in the gut, your body can recirculate
Yeah.
these toxins back through the body, through the liver,
Yeah.
and deposit them again.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how
Mm-hmm.
your gut microbiome can play a role. But again, if I'm pooping every day, fiber lowers your breast cancer risk. Why? Because you're going to the bathroom more and you're binding toxins,
Yeah.
right? Hydration probably does too. We just haven't
Yeah.
actually done the research, right?
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right, at least I haven't seen it. Let me rephrase that. I haven't done a bunch of research on hydration levels and breast cancer research, but I would argue that it probably is impactful.
I would speculate you're right. And that's actually an interesting question because I always see it in terms of colon health. I
Mm-hmm.
never
Yeah.
I
Yep.
never see it in terms of hydration health. Oh, I might dive down that hole. That's an interesting hole. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. No, I like that tangible kind of breakdown as well as an accessible breakdown audience. I think
Mhm.
audience in particular those who are seeing hormone profiles because it is I will offer especially when we're talking about our SIPs, the 1A1, the 1B1 and the 3A4, it is very common to see suboptimal presentations there insofar as you're very happy to be making the 4 or the 16, right?
Mhm.
But that does not mean you're kind of handcuffed to that. Here, all of the foods, the broccoli foods, the dark leafy greens, the berries, the flax, the soys that can be consuming, as well as simply just not aggravating, not bringing things in that you are required to detox, because then body can spend more time on detoxing estrogen as opposed to detoxing whatever else it is you are bringing in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. I like that, especially knowing your detox genes gives you a really tangible place to, hey, I do not do glutathione well. Let me focus on supporting that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and you know what, if you dig into the literature and look, a high expression of 1B1 has association with things like
Yeah.
fibroids and estrogen
Mm-hmm.
sort
Yeah.
of things. And it makes sense. You're like, oh, it's not the estrogen, just the estrogen you make. It's your capacity to get rid of things that look like estrogen and your estrogen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And 200 years ago, it probably wasn't a big deal, but now it is because we have all these toxins that look like estrogen.
Yeah. Yeah. An audience, just for awareness, you're going to be looking for G alleles largely
Mhm.
that will be problematic in those three genes that we just spoke of. And if you go into your DNA 360 report, you don't have to do the interpreting. It
Mhm.
will be there for you further within the report. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we have some questions from the audience, and I wonder if that's what we start shifting to. Before we do that, Dr. Murray, is there any other little pearl or consideration that you want to offer the audience, especially when we're thinking through a plan of how do we go about prevention? Because we've kind of touched on obviously the basics: eat well,
Mhm.
sleep well, don't stress, blah, blah, blah. You've dug a lot deeper into kind of the estrogen's really important. So be mindful to your body's access to it
Mhm.
throughout life. Um, Audience, we have a lot of presentation from Dr. Murray on estrogen replacement therapies. So we'll make sure within the chat we're posting some of those webinars because we didn't dive deeply into the supplemental side of it, but it's very
Yeah.
important. And then you also really talk through the importance of diet and how diet can shift how you're going about wrapping everything up with the tissue paper. Any other little tidbits that you want to offer?
Yeah, I would say I think there's a book that I think every woman should read, and if you don't want to read it, listen to it on Audible. That's what I did. It's called Estrogen Matters by Dr. Avram Blooming. He's a breast cancer oncologist. His wife was a breast cancer survivor. He has been training and working in oncology for 50 years. And he just recently released that book with updated research. But it goes through all of the research. It's kind of reiterating what I sort of covered and how estrogen has been sort of demonized inappropriately and that it's actually protective. And particularly for women who might be in menopause, because I know the age group, I'm highly seasoned also. I'm 55, which is what I like to call it. We're just more seasoned than the rest. That hormone replacement is on the table for every woman just as an opportunity. That it's not causing breast cancer, that there's usually a constellation of things that are happening. There's a 10 million woman study that published last year looking at breast cancer at all causes of dying risk. And they
Mm-hmm.
showed the women that were on bioidentical hormones and never got off of them had a 16% reduced risk for breast cancer. And these women average age were in their 70s.
Yeah.
Right. So the reality is we've argued that stuff in a way that has taken it away from women. So like the boomers and the Gen Xers should at least be mad that we've been kind of robbed of that early argument, but that doesn't
Yeah.
mean you can't do it.
Yeah.
But you largely have agency over
Yeah.
this because you can change your diet. I did see
Mm-hmm.
someone put a comment out there. I'm gonna state this. So there's a lot of information out right now about foods, vegetable foods being toxic, lectins, oxalates,
Mm.
phthalates. So let me see if I can explain this in a way that makes it very simple. Vegetables cannot run for you, neither can fruit. They are trapped in the ground. They have these compounds to protect themselves so they can reproduce and grow,
Yeah.
right? Those same things that trigger that plant to support itself are also part of the reason why they're antioxidants, phenols, all these other things. So plants have these things and they actually stimulate our antioxidant reserves, our activity, our endogenous production of antioxidants. And they also help our microbiome. And we've been told, oh, you can't do, can't do broccoli if you have thyroid issues. What I would say is you can do those
Yeah.
things. You just don't want to do 15 cups a week, right?
Yeah.
It's about distribution. So
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember that you can't have the same food every day, right? I couldn't eat the same thing, but I can today. So the reality is
Yeah.
you want to eat seasonal, and the biggest part of your plate
Yeah.
should be plant based. Not that
Yeah.
you don't eat meat. I'm not going to get into that argument today,
Yeah.
but all of the research shows that
Yeah.
eating this wide variety, because they do
Yeah.
influence these pathways. So I think it's
Yeah.
important to know that you can really do that. Just don't juice an entire bag of kale, right? Don't do that, because that's not
Yeah.
how we were ever going to eat that.
Yeah. Yeah. I find actually, I've seen this when counseling people who have children who will not eat vegetable.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the homework well, for the first question I ask is, what are the adults eating? Because by and large, the child eats what the adults eat. But outside of that, in this idea of how do we encourage, what I'll say is, hey, parents, go to the grocery store with your child once a week and have them pick out a fun fruit or vegetable that they've never seen before, and you two learn together how to cook it, right? Instills good patterns. And by and large, the biggest feedback outside of success that I've heard from this is parents coming back and saying, I did not realize I was eating the exact same thing almost every single day. I meal prep and therefore all my breakfasts are the same. I go to an office and I always go to the same food vendor at lunch, and therefore my lunches are always the same. And the diversity in the food, and therefore the diversity in the phytochemicals and the things within those antioxidants, those
Mm-hmm.
those those things that give us all those antioxidant properties, people don't have access to anymore. So I would challenge audiences, one of the takeaways is keep a food diary for a week and see how often you're eating the exact same thing.
Just take
And
a picture, open a
yeah,
notepad, take a picture every time you put something in your mouth, and then do it for a couple of
yeah,
weeks, and you'll be surprised. You'll be like, oh my God, I eat 15 foods and some
yeah,
variation.
yeah, 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 yeah. And then go to the grocery store and every week pick out a new food. And I don't say that condescendingly.
Oh,
I do the same practice. I go to a grocery store, I rotate between different cultural grocery stores, and I pick out something. I'm like, I've never seen that before, and I'm going to figure this out. It's good
yeah,
for your brain, it's good for your tummy.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah. So let's move into questions and answers. But before I do that, I've seen a few times in the chat people just asking where they can access some of the genes that we've been talking about. The hormone specific genes. So I'm talking about your CYP1A1, your 1B1, and your 3A4. All of those are going to be your hormone and fitness test. So if you just go to the system summary, that's probably the most convenient and easy space to be accessing it. When we're talking about some of the detox genes that we have talked about, most of those are going to sit in the inflammation section. There should be, if you're on the app, there will be a summary section. If you're within the portal, there'll be individual reports dedicated to each one. Okay. So let us jump into our questions that the audience is offering. So let's see. Isa, I hope I'm saying that right. Isa. Um, they were wondering, how much do you think endocrine disruptors such as birth control, hormone replacement, fragrance, phthalates, parabens, and other toxic things in so-called beauty products contribute to your risk of breast cancer? And so this came from the top of the hour, I think, before we started into this, some of this conversation. But did you want to hone in a little bit more specifically around just simply how toxic a lot of the things that women have been sold to put on their body
Yeah.
are for their bodies? Yeah.
Yeah. So I will remove hormone replacement from that list just because
Hmm.
the data doesn't really support that. However, fragrances, phthalates, parabens, toxins, um, are, I would say, probably the biggest perpetuators of this. The problem is it's not about one thing. I think this is the challenge.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just the phthalate or the parabens that are in your body care products. It's
Hmm.
these things may have been looked at as a single ingredient and then a dose relationship. Like, how
Yeah.
much are you getting on average?
Yeah.
We've never looked at the totality of those things. Like, the average woman puts somewhere between 119 and 100, I think 57, depending on the study, different chemicals on their body just getting ready in the morning, right? They've never been
Owns you.
tested like that.
Yeah.
So I'll give an example because to me, it's not a breast cancer example, but there's been this surprising uptick in young women getting small cell lung cancer,
Mm.
right? And they're not smokers. And they were trying to like narrow this down. And literally, this study that was published had come to the conclusion that it was fragrances and candles.
Oh.
Like, it's
Oh.
the plugins, the fragrances and candles. It's all
Yeah.
these synthetic fragrances being inhaled.
Yeah.
Right. And I was kind of shocked by that. I was like, I mean, not that I didn't think it was
Yeah.
toxic, but that they had gotten down to this very specific thing because it's compared to men, it's
Yeah.
less. Men don't tend to do that.
Hmm.
We tend to
Yep.
hover over them and we have
Yeah.
50 of them going. And so the reality is these toxins, it's about the total load and all of them
Yeah.
together. And I think that's
Yeah.
really driving the cancers that we see, particularly in younger women. And then
Hmm.
we have the COVID sort of
Yeah.
thing that has amplified that we
Yeah.
haven't really completely ferreted out.
Yeah. Yeah. As well as the decrease in our diet and the impact to our biomes and all the fun things. But I like that cumulative and additive because I always find people get, there's an element of marketing. I remember when BPA first came out on the scene and everyone was scared of it. And so what companies started doing is they're like, we don't have BPA, we're using BPB. So it was just a cousin. It was
Potato,
just a cousin,
potato.
but we're not
Same
using it.
thing.
And then a few years later, we recognized, oh, same, right? And so there's an element of marketing. So be very, very mindful as you're going through things. Honestly, the fewer ingredients, by and large, that tends to be safer. And you want to think through glass things as opposed to plastic things, et cetera,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Like, I was just in Europe a couple months ago. I was in London
Hmm.
and like they don't have disposable anything.
No.
I was so proud of that. I was like, this is amazing. And if we just
Yeah.
did that in the United States, A, we would not be destroying the planet. And B, we'd be a healthier group of people
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
everything's disposable here. Everything.
Hmm. 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 Yeah. And well, I think also too, part of that without having the disposable elements of it, it shifts more food at home or more like it shifts a lot of behaviors too. I think that's an interesting part. It's not just the plastic, it's also the element of convenience.
Mm-hmm.
And the convenience factor is where you kind of get a lot of the additive crap in
Yeah.
there that accumulates, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's an element of, and this is a difficult element in such a fast-paced society, but if you're able to cook your food at home and control that to a certain extent, that shifts outcomes compared to.
Yeah. And that's something that we largely have some control of,
Yeah.
without having to go like put yourself on an island in the middle of nowhere. You know what I mean? To like not be toxic, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So our next question is coming from Marianne, and this was at about 6:30, and I think this is when we'd first started jumping into hormones.
Yeah.
Marianne is asking, what about high estradiol postmenopausally? So maybe Marianne's done like a Dutch or some blood work. What
Mm-hmm.
about high estradiol?
Yeah. So we have three estrogens. We have estrone, estradiol, and estriol. Estradiol is the one made by the ovaries. So by the time we go through menopause, our ovaries have kind of shriveled up like a walnut and they're not making estradiol generally, right? They're not making it. So most of the time, you're going to see a relatively low. Now, estrone is made by our fat cells by converting testosterone into estrone, and estrone can be made into estradiol and back and forth.
Hmm.
And you can test for estrone. You can see estrone on a urinary test. You can also see it on a blood test. You can even see estrone sulfate, which is one step down from that.
Hmm.
Often, if estradiol or estrone are elevated above what would be considered a menopausal range in a menopausal woman, it's often in that category. It might be the fat cells making it. The adrenals can make a little bit, but they don't make very much.
Hmm.
But that's often where we see it, because women always wonder, like, why did I gain weight during menopause? Right.
Hmm.
On average, women pick up about 15% of their body weight and in additional weight, just doing the same
Hmm.
thing you were doing before. And some of that is your body going, hey, you're going to need a little
Hmm.
more estrogen. So we're going to give
Yeah.
you that to make it. So
Yeah.
I often look at it that way, that
Yeah.
there's somewhere we're getting it, and it's maybe the fat cells producing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if you're lean, but generally, if
Yeah.
if you're like
Yeah.
me and you got junk in the trunk, it might be the junk in the trunk that's making it.
Yeah. No. And
I
I
would
think
look,
that,
and that's where that hormone test would be advantageous, and
yeah.
maybe looking at your genetics to see maybe you're not getting rid of it, right?
Yeah. And that speaks to how much the body wants estrogen, right? If when it loses its organs or it loses the functionality within organs that traditionally would have made it, it's like, cool, we're going to make our own organ.
Yeah.
And fat is an organ.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Our next question is coming from Alexandra. So, Alexandra is saying, can you discuss those of us with dense breast tissues? What are the best things that can be done in prevention? Are mammograms useful, or do you want to go straight to ultrasound? So, Dr. Marie, I'd love if you can kind of touch on some imaging. Prior
Yeah.
to that, though, I do want to speak through the DNA breast 360 test because I think
Yes.
this is a neat, under discussed way to kind of support some of the screening for breast cancer. So when we talk about imaging, there's an element of access, right? You have to be a certain age. So Betty can go into the specifics. It'll vary by region and healthcare plan, et cetera. But you kind of have to be 40s and above to access imaging unless you have a marked history. And then there also has to be physical access to it. You have to have means, money, and or location to go to. So this really impacts rural areas. Um, there, as well as when you do imaging, really you're looking for something that already exists, and therefore you're going to be going about it there. There's other ways from a blood and from a tear perspective that we can be surveying for cancer. So I really want to introduce to the conversation the idea of it's not just imaging once there's already a mass growing. We now have technology that kind of can come a step before that and look at that in that very beginning infancy stage. So one of the tests is going to be a tear test, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So your tears are an ultrafiltrate. They effectively come from they're liquid portions of the blood. And so when your body is filtering in order to make that lubrication, that tear, the blood still stay in, but there are some markers, some protein markers that stay out. And so you can actually get a test that will collect your tears. And the tears are measured for their protein. And there's two different proteins that speak to inflammatory changes that come about when there is the beginnings or the presence of breast cancer. So, this is not diagnostic. There are people walking around with these sort of inflammatory changes that don't have breast cancer, but it is a great way, in particular, for people with more either don't have access physically or more dense breasts and you're concerned about imaging, right? So, that is one way. Another way would be something like, uh, we have a test that looks across all different sorts of cancer, right? And so this is a test that's a serum sample and it quite literally analyzes your blood for different DNA markings of cancer, breast chief amongst those. So I would offer, I think imaging is really important. I do want Dr. Murray to go through it because it is excuse me, standard of care. And it's very, very important, right? But there are other tests that can be taken, blood and tears, that can give you that sort of insight. And we'll make sure that between Vanny and Katie, those tests can go into the chat so you can consider them. Okay. Yeah. And so, but let's talk about imaging because it is standard of care and it's really important. I don't want to discount it. I just
Yeah.
want to also introduce to the conversation. We're not only having to do imaging, which to an extent is reactive because you have to see something in order for that to be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to understand like mammograms, whether it's mammograms, sonograms, or MRI
Yeah.
are not prevention. They're detection, right? Because it's either zero or something's there, right? Now, so if you have dense breast tissues, fibrocystic and or dense breast tissue, which is the vast majority of women, right? What it does is when they go in there and squash your breast for a mammogram, so they compress the breast so they can squeeze out the surface area and get a better image because it's a gross image, right? Um, when they do that, it makes it harder to identify if something is abnormal because think of it as kind of lumpy and bumpy, right? And so often those with dense breast tissue may get, a not quite visible area of their breast. So they might get called back to do a sonogram. Sonograms have the ability to visualize it differently, but I wouldn't say necessarily better. They're using those two to
Mm-hmm.
compound and decide whether they need to go and do it again. So
Mm-hmm.
often, if it comes back abnormal, then they come back and do another diagnostic mammogram, more localized, more focused on the
Mm-hmm.
area in question, sonogram again. And then, if both of those are true, then they often do an MRI.
Mm-hmm.
MRI is by far more definitive, but by far more expensive and even harder to
Mm-hmm.
access. So, imaging is important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Depending on where you're at, England has different requirements, US, Canada, we all
Mm-hmm.
have different requirements, age requirements.
Yeah.
I think we're a little aggressive in the number and frequency of imaging because the more you image tissue that is
Mm-hmm.
hormone sensitive and radiation sensitive, the more there is some concern and risk. So I think there's
Yeah.
sort of a balancing act. Um, and there's newer technology, but it hasn't really made it out into the larger public. There's
Yeah.
a QT imaging, which is a water sonogram that actually has the definition of an MRI without compression, without any radiation.
Mm-hmm.
There's like 5 of those in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So those with fibrocystic breast disease I don't even want to use the word disease. It's fibrocystic breast or dense breast,
Mm-hmm.
likely to potentially get called back. And you could choose to do a sonogram, right, as additional, even if they don't come back suspect.
Mm-hmm.
What I do want to say is things like caffeine, sometimes coffee, have been
Mm-hmm.
shown to potentially increase fibrocystic activity, particularly if you are a coffee fiend,
Yeah.
right? Especially in postmenopausal women. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes cutting back on caffeine and coffee, there's some studies that don't show it, but if you are, a
You
multi
know,
day,
interestingly, with that's related, CYP1A1. So if
yep,
you have a faster rate of your CYP1A1, so audience, if you're looking at your CYP1A1, that's in your hormone report,
yep,
and you have a G allele there, you're going to be processing a bit quicker. And so caffeine is going to impact this a lot more.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so, those are things to think about. Sometimes iodine deficiency, I am not a
Hmm.
proponent of high dose iodine without iodine testing and validity, but iodine deficiency can also affect that tissue as well.
Hmm.
But like I said, most women, the vast majority of us have dense breast tissue.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So,
And then there's also like liquid biopsy and other ones to look at too.
yeah, yeah. I think it's important we diversify that conversation a little bit because I think up until I'll say the 2000s, imaging was our best offering, and
Yeah.
it's still an important offering. But science has progressed so much that we have so many different viewpoints into the body, and it's important we start incorporating those, advocating for. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Kitty has asked our next question. We did touch on it. Kitty was wondering, what do you think about sulforaphane? So many
Mhm.
syllables, as a supplement. And so I think we did touch on that, especially Kitty being mindful of how much, because
Mhm.
the supplement itself, um, highly concentrated, it's like sitting down and eating. I don't know what it's equivalent to. It can be equivalent, several heads of broccoli,
Yeah.
which traditionally you wouldn't be doing. So there's a huge element of how much and why. I think,
Mhm.
especially in cancer cases, it's really mindfully used. It can be used in prevention, but you got to talk with someone about how much and how frequently. Any other
Yeah.
thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, and sulforaphane is like indole 3-carbinol and DIM. It's one of the compounds in broccoli that
Mm-hmm.
move these detox pathways.
Yeah.
And so it can be beneficial, but again, you can kind of overdo a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw a lot of this when it first came on the market, and a lot of people are using it because I thought it was like this longevity thing.
Yeah.
And then women found out after the fact that, hey, it messes around with your estrogen and you're not gonna feel great living long if you're always using that. Yeah.
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 Yeah, for sure.
All right. Isa has another question for us. Dr. Murray, I love that you're like, I'm not going to get into this, but here we are. Um,
That's okay. Actually, I will talk about this because it's what you do to prevent cancer may not be what you do if you're treating cancer.
yeah, no, and I just valued that you're like, I'm not going to get into that. And the gods were like, haha, not today.
Ah, today you
Haha.
shall talk about this. Yeah.
All right. So, thoughts on meat and hormones. If you have hormone positive cancer, since animals and animal products have hormones, should we avoid them if we have breast cancer? Safe or not to eat? What a
All right.
delightfully loaded question.
Yeah, it is a delightfully loaded question. So, you know, anytime we can get an animal that has not been treated with hormones or exposed
Mhm.
to hormones is going to be advantageous because
Yeah.
hormones are fat soluble. So they're going to hang out in the fat of those tissues. So even the leanest cut of fish or chicken or beef is still going to have
Yeah.
some of those hormones present. Right. So dairy and meat products are some of those things that, if you eat them, I highly recommend getting organic because you're going to reduce that
Mhm.
load, right? Because they're not
Mhm.
going to give RBST and other things to it. Now, protein intake, animal protein intake is, we're identifying more and more that we need protein, and animal protein has the essential amino acids at a combination that help with muscle protein synthesis. You can do that with vegetarian forms, but you have to be really mindful of what you eat to get enough protein and enough of the essential amino acids. What's really
Mhm.
interesting is often a higher protein, lower carbohydrate, less processed foods, but not necessarily lower carb as a whole. So not low vegetable, not low
Mhm.
legume, is cancer preventative. Now,
Mhm.
if you have breast cancer, what's really interesting is probably the diet that has been most studied and showed to be one of the most advantageous during treatment for breast cancer would be a low animal food diet. And here's the
Mhm.
reason why: breast cancer cells and lots of other tumor cells cannot convert homocysteine to methionine properly. There's an
Mhm.
error in methionine processing, right? Which has to do with MTHFR, MTR, MTRR. So again, if you have those genetics, we can look at those. And so if you rob the body of methionine, which is a sulfur bearing
Mhm.
amino acid, which is very high in animal protein, you rob its exogenous capacity to get it from the food. So
Mhm.
a very high, like, vegetarian diet is actually
Mhm.
going to help when you're under treatment. So I would say you don't necessarily have to remove it completely, and you definitely don't necessarily need to remove it if you don't have breast
Mhm.
cancer. But when I'm under treatment, like, we put people on a low methionine diet, and we drive that
Mhm.
level down as far as we can go, so the
Yeah.
cells don't use it for fuel,
Yeah.
to remethylate. So, but that doesn't mean you have to be vegetarian. It just means that we're gonna push that vegetable quotient really, really
Yeah.
high.
Yeah. I like that you're teasing out, Dr. Murray, the application in specific circumstances. Because I think we hear, especially through social media, we hear about carnivore this, keto this, fasting this. And like, for example, I love fasting for many different cancer protocols. Does that
Mm-hmm.
mean fasting is appropriate all the time? Or if you're sitting on that healthier side of things, absolutely not. Diets are always studied in context of, and then it tends to be that really healthy, well-rounded diet that supports longevity by and large, a happy, a balanced carb diet, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's the difference between a therapeutic diet that is driving
Yes.
towards a treatment, and
Yeah.
then the diet that is your maintenance diet. Those are never the same,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
The more
Yeah.
extreme the diet is, the more it might be therapeutic. It is not a lifetime diet. That's not what
Yeah.
it's designed to do.
Yeah. And here, that when you're on social media and they're telling you that if you
That's
only eat this, you're going to live forever, probably not so much. Yeah. All right. Isa has another question for us.
yeah.
Can you also clear up the conflicting information about soy and whether or not it's safe to consume if you've had breast cancer?
Oh, so
Oh,
I'm going to qualify soy. Always organic, non-GMO, right? Because
yeah.
GMO foods are Franken foods. They've got DNA that they shouldn't have, right? They got bacterial
Hmm.
DNA that has been randomly inserted, so they can spray stuff on them, right?
Hmm.
So here's what's really interesting: flax lignans Soy isoflavones and genistein have shown
Hmm.
to be cancer protective.
Hmm.
So they have
Yeah.
studied those in breast cancer itself.
Hmm.
And those are usually found in your fermented soy products, right? So I'm not a fan of downing soy milk like it's going out of style, or eating isolates in foods. Like, we're eating a ton of soy, we just don't know it because it's hidden in processed foods. But fermented soy like tempeh, tofu, your miso, and things like that can actually be part of a healthy diet, particularly a breast cancer survivor diet, because those phytoestrogens, again, sit on those estrogen receptor B receptors very, very loosely. Like, they swing by and they sort of tickle the receptor and move on. And they've shown to be, protective, right? Despite being soy, but despite being a plant estrogen, right?
Hmm.
Because again, it's like,
Yeah.
why is a plant estrogen safe? Because it's probably sitting on that receptor and blocking other stuff from getting on
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. And I think that that speaks a lot to, we always hear about traditional Japanese women, traditional meaning traditional diet.
Yep.
Um, and there being such a lower incidence of menopause issues, of cancer, of hormone influence cancers, et cetera. And you think about a primary component and of traditional diet, no
Mhm.
longer, but traditional diet. And there tends to be a lot of that there. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Marianne has our next question. I read that grapefruit can promote breast cancer. Is this accurate?
I've never seen that before.
I've never heard of this in particular because I always think to like I've heard of citrus pectin being very important within certain cancer protocols. I've never
Yeah.
heard of this one. So Marianne, maybe if you want to later on follow up with the source on that one,
Yeah.
we can offer comment, but I've never heard of this, so
Yeah.
I can't comment on it.
So the thing is grapefruit can influence some of those detox pathways, right? That's why you don't do grapefruit with a lot of medications that go through the CYP pathways, right? Because it's going to interfere with how that drug gets metabolized. However, so your grapefruits and citrus bioflavonoids,
Hmm.
and then the pectin, which is part of that,
Yeah.
sort of membrane part of it,
Hmm.
all been used in a protective sort of way.
Hmm.
So yeah, if you could find, I would be interested in reading it just because I've never seen that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard like grapefruit impact on liver and how you metabolize certain drugs, but not outside of that. Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. Oh, I know you're going to love this question, Dr. Murray. Anne is saying, at 69, are they too old for HRT?
No. So so here's the thing. So what we know from the research, right, is we have one big study, the Women's Health Initiative, which took it off the table for women, but the women that were on Premarin alone actually showed reduced risk for breast cancer. And what we know now, matter of fact, there was a study that came out earlier this week that showed that it was a synthetic progestin, medroxyprogesterone, right? That is the risk profile, particularly when we get older. So we don't use that anymore. That's so
Mhm.
old school. Like, nobody uses that. So at 69, yes, you are outside of what we would call the most ideal window. So,
Mhm.
and this is mostly coming from cognition studies. So when we go into perimenopause and menopause, the brain actually shrinks and remodels itself. That's why we have memory issues, right? The brain, it's kind of like reroutes pathways to creative centers and sort of moves it away from memory, right? And so they showed that if you did hormone replacement, you sort of halted that activity.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean you can't do hormone replacement. We have lots of women that are in their 60s, 70s, and still
Mhm.
that are still on hormones, that maybe even started them in their 60s. We just maybe didn't halt that remodeling
Mhm.
process before it got started,
Yep.
right? Every woman, regardless of age, deserves the conversation with a medical provider trained in hormone replacement therapy,
Yeah.
not just any old Joe Blow, because they don't know, because we don't have menopause training, right? Even OB-GYN, less than 20% have even an hour of menopause training.
Mm.
So you need one
Mm.
that's been trained to assess you individually. Most
Yeah.
women can enjoy the use of hormone replacement therapy in menopause, even if they're quite a bit of ways out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And for the nerds out there, Dr. Murray, myself, Dr. Varden, we're working on some menopause training because it's a huge gap to say that medical professionals have gone through and 50% of the population, they're completely blind to a very significant health moment in their lives. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Our last question this evening is coming from Oh, mon Dieu, Mare. You've been here before, and I don't know how to say your name, so I apologize. Mare is my best guess. Um, in Mare's course, I'm not familiar with what HTMA is, but in their course, they've learned that estrogen can cause copper toxicity. Is birth control different from bioidentical hormones when it comes to copper dysregulation?
I'd have to look. I don't trust my research on birth control
Mm-hmm.
because most of what I do is perimenopause and menopause, and we're
Yeah.
usually like, get off the birth control, So I don't trust my stats on that. But let's talk about
Mm,
what copper. So
yeah.
copper and zinc compete with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And copper is essential to cellular metabolism. So it's not like we don't want it. And we also have lots of genes that you can find in your DNA tests that have to do with your
Yep.
accessibility of copper and copper transport, or not copper, zinc transport.
Zinc. Yeah.
Sorry.
So
I'm
close.
having a menopausal moment. Zinc transport. So it's not uncommon to see somebody deficient in zinc anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we get to estrogen, estrogen has a high affinity for copper and can increase copper absorption and serum copper levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we end up with way, way too much and we're doing synthetic hormones, that would probably drive a little more of this copper absorption, copper toxicity, by also basically taking over the spot where zinc plays, right? Because they compete.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an indirect connection, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily direct with HRT or even birth control. What I would say, even more importantly, is it's good to know genetically, are you more likely to have zinc deficiency? And
Mm-hmm.
then you can test for serum copper and serum zinc. And if copper is high, you can also test for ceruloplasmin, which happens to be the carrier, because you could have things like pyroluria and other things that might affect your ability to keep that zinc and copper balanced.
Mm-hmm.
So estrogen plays a role, but in itself, it's not necessarily going to drive toxicity without, I would say, without an other reason for zinc to be low relative to it, right? And
Yeah.
we do use like copper IUDs and other things that might drive
Mm-hmm.
it a little bit higher.
Yeah.
But like we routinely look at zinc and copper levels in
Yeah.
patients to see if they're balanced, because it's way more common that someone is just low in zinc.
Yeah. 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 No, I think that's reasonable. Yeah, the only connection I can think through there is I know that when you're actively going through cancer, copper is not something you ideally want to be supplementing with. That's really the only
Yeah,
thing I can think of, but
yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah. So, audience, it's so wonderful that you've joined us here this evening. I'm just trying to look quickly through the chat and seeing if there's anything else there. I'm seeing a shout out to my cat. So, Catherine,
Yes,
I'm
I think
grateful.
there was a question.
Yeah.
I think there was a question
Oh,
about GLPs. That was the only one that I saw.
yeah.
I haven't
Okay.
already answered.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so Sue's asking a question. GLP-1, so again, this is the famous weight loss drug. Um, do they have a protective effect when it comes to breast cancer?
Yeah. So I have, in honesty, I have not looked to see if we've done any studies looking at that. But
Hmm.
GLPs obviously have major mechanisms at
Yeah.
reducing insulin resistance, basically affecting the brain centers that have to do with hunger and satiety, and they slow gastric
Yeah.
emptying. And they're anti-inflammatory. That's what we start to
Hmm.
see, right?
Hmm.
So indirectly, would it help with glucose metabolism, which is going to reduce
Hmm.
your risk, and also weight loss, right? So I would say it's not a direct effect; it's probably a secondary effect
Yeah.
because of its metabolic effect at weight loss and satiety and insulin sensitivity.
Yeah.
Because again, extra body weight, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, all of those drive the risk for breast cancer up.
Yeah. 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 I think we see some evidence in regards to pancreatic cancers, not directly, but I think this is kind of where you see like the GLP-1 babies, right?
Yeah,
In the
yeah, yeah.
sense of a woman who had never been able to get pregnant starts this, shifts markedly metabolically, and then all of a sudden is pregnant because they weren't taking protective measures because they didn't expect this to be a possibility. So I think it because it shifts metabolism, it might, but I think it's going to also take a long time before we amass enough data to have insight, honestly, one way or the other. Yeah. Okay. Um, I believe that might be that. So, audience, thank you so much for being with us this evening. We really value you showing up.
I
Dr.
saw that.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
where was it? It was just there. Marianne did put a little like
Oh, did she?
there. So I'm
Okay.
gonna go see if I can find it, Marianne, and
Yeah.
I'll dig through it because I have not seen that. So I will always admit if I haven't seen it.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I'll see if I
Yeah.
can dig it. Yeah, dig it through it.
Yeah. Suggests connection between breast cancer and grapefruit juice. Interesting.
I
Yeah.
wonder if this is a retrospective
Yeah.
retrospective diet epidemiology. Those are always
Yeah.
questionable,
Yeah.
So I'll go look at it
Yeah.
and I'll have my opinion next time
Yeah.
around.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, we'll
Oh,
make
this is a
sure that we
nurse's
share
health
that.
study. So
Mm.
we probably don't have time, but the nurse's health study was a dietary recall, right? They ask you how much grapefruit juice do you drink? How much diet soda do you drink? And then they back into it, right? Which
Hmm.
these kind of studies have what I would call low validity because they're
Yes.
asking, I can't remember what I ate 2 days ago, but they're asking nurses, hey, how many times a week do you drink grapefruit juice? And don't, and they ignore
Yeah.
the smoke, the overweight, the whatever. Da, 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 da. So I'm
Hmm.
going to dig a little bit more, but one of them was definitely the nurse's health study. And then one of the other ones was
Yeah.
it's part of the Harvard's nurse's health study. So I'll
Yeah.
dig through it, but I would take that with some very high suspicion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When clinicians diet recall is a big tool within clinicians. And so there's been studies on, is it a reliable call?
Mhm.
And I think it was like only 20% of diet recalls are even kind of accurate, meaning 80% of diet recalls are not at all accurate. So asking in a study and then to your point backing in, it's not to completely discount. We should review the study and kind of look at methods and et cetera, but it does put a little bit of a flag there. And I'm
Yeah.
also surprised at how many people drink grapefruit juice. There's always research on it, and I don't know anyone that drinks it.
Do people?
Is it an
Yeah.
American thing?
Well, no, it's because they look at it because it interferes with so many different drugs
Oh,
metabolism. So it's always one of those. If you're on this, don't.
yeah. Okay. All right.
So there was a study that mentioned that smoking or eggs were more damaging to you than smoking, and that was a
Oh.
diet recall. And they literally looked at it and they compared how many eggs someone said they ate in a once every 6 month study. Like, how many do you eat them? I couldn't possibly tell you. And then they compared it and said, oh, it's worse than smoking. I'm like, okay,
Um,
so grain of
yeah.
salt. So I will
Mm.
dig through these, Marianne, and I'll look
Okay.
at them and
Okay.
say,
Awesome. Well, nerd extraordinaire, I'm so very grateful that you come to these because I learn every time from them, and I know that the audience learns from you as well. So thank you for coming in and offering very discerning numbers and very discerning perspective. I really appreciate it because I think the space around breast cancer is very um, not intentionally so, but it's fear mongered. And so it's
yes,
nice to be able to take some of the fear out and offer actionable things that we can be doing. So, audience, I hope you have a better guidance now. I hope you're able to share this with your friends and family. We do a lot of webinars to the end of supporting you. So, if you have any feedback, don't hesitate to reach out. It's CEO@thednacompany.com. And until next time, we bid you all the adieus. Au revoir, mes amis. Au revoir.
Thank you all very much. Have a good night.
Oh, yes, she's dancing because she knows it's dancing time. We dance because we're happy.